Look at the sprawling grid of the Pruitt-Igoe development. In the mid-20th century, urban planners approached mass housing as a pure math problem, maximizing the number of identical units they could stack on a single plot of land. It was hailed as a utopian fix for urban crowding. Yet, within 10 years of its completion, the complex was entirely consumed by extreme poverty, high crime rates, and severe physical decay. By 1972, the city of St. Louis gave up. They wired the buildings with explosives and leveled the entire multi-million-dollar project to the ground. The architects treated these massive structures as static, finished products delivered to a population. They ignored that human shelter is an evolving, living process. This top-down model still dominates modern megacities. We see it in the overwhelming walls of identical apartment windows lining the streets of Hong Kong. Within these massive concrete blocks, residents have no clear sense of personal territory. The tower is effectively owned by no one, which creates a significant psychological strain on those packed inside. Every single unit is laid out with exactly the same dimensions. This uniformity actively ignores how different families need sunlight, how they interact with their neighbors, and the specific daily rituals of their culture. Treating a diverse population as a single mathematical group strips away the cultural identities and individual needs of the residents. Modern urban planners are trapped in a difficult bind. As global populations concentrate in cities, building high-density, multi-level housing is an absolute mathematical necessity. This animation shows the default solution, focusing entirely on physical density. This is a strict equation, calculating the maximum number of shelter units that can be physically packed onto a confined grid of land. But maximizing physical density ignores a much more volatile metric: perceived crowding. Crowding is not a hard number. It is a psychological state. A space feels intolerably cramped or perfectly comfortable, entirely depending on the unique cultural preferences of the people living inside it. Culture consists of an intangible way of life, the specific behaviors, social norms, and daily rituals passed between generations. Over long stretches of time, specific environmental limitations, local geography, and the physical climate force a community to adapt, cementing these specific ways of living. Planners must stop treating density as a pure math equation. Instead, they have to engineer physical frameworks that actively absorb and mitigate that psychological feeling of crowding. Mitigating that sense of crowding requires a specific architectural theory. Planners must intentionally design a sense of place. You cannot create a sense of place by accident. It requires engineering a rigid, multi-level hierarchy of spatial ownership that scales outward from the individuals to the city. The foundational level of this hierarchy is the individual dwelling unit. Looking at this unit footprint, architect Oscar Newman theorized that a resident must be able to clearly claim a physical territory. This visible boundary creates a defensible, personalized space where the individual exerts total control. Moving one step up the hierarchy brings us to the residential area, or the localized neighborhood cluster. Here, architect Hermann Hertzberger argues that collective areas cannot be empty voids. They must be explicitly designed to force face-to-face meetings, using narrow, organic streetscapes and balconies that ensure high visibility and spontaneous social interaction. The final level of the hierarchy scales up to the wider town. Architectural theorist Christian Norberg Schultz established that a town's overarching landscape must possess distinct visual differences and unique spatial characteristics. When pathways, topography, and public squares are visually distinct from one another, they anchor the community, giving the entire settlement a cohesive identity. True community does not organically emerge in a sterile void. It demands this deliberate, layered structural framework, expanding step by step from the private bedroom to the public square. In the 1980s, architect Charles Correa attempted a radical real-world application of this hierarchy in New Bombay, designing the Bellapore Incremental Housing Project. Correa operated on a specific philosophy: mass housing should be treated as a process, much like a bird building its own nest. His top-down master plan provided only the absolute bare minimum, a basic starter house. He intentionally required the bottom-up participation of the residents to adapt and finish the structures themselves. This top-down schematic shows how Correa relied on a strict mathematical clustering system to achieve urban density. It begins at the first tier of the hierarchy with a single unit footprint. Each individual unit was explicitly designed with an attached private courtyard, ensuring families had a dedicated outdoor space for domestic activities and daily rituals during most of the year. These individual units then scale up to form the neighborhood layer. 7 homes form a distinct cluster, arranged tightly around a shared 8 by 8 meter communal square. Finally, the project scales to the macro level. 3 of these 7-unit groups combine to form a module of 21 homes, sharing a much larger 12 by 12 meter collective space. But to guarantee that this dense layout could adapt over time, Correa enforced one critical structural rule across the entire site. None of the buildings within the clusters shared any party walls. Every single home was an entirely freestanding structure. This separation was crucial. By detaching the units, individual families could expand, remodel, and adapt their own homes entirely independently, without interfering with their neighbors' structural integrity. The homes relied on simple floor plans made of basic brick and plaster. This allowed local craftspeople and masons to construct and alter the units, bypassing massive corporate construction firms. By combining a high-density communal layout with freestanding, adaptable structures, Correa engineered a mass housing framework that mathematically achieved density while embracing human individuality. However, the actual implementation of participatory urban planning is rarely pristine. When an architect designs a system specifically for user adaptation, they must entirely surrender control over the final aesthetic and the ultimate function of the space. In Bellapore, the first major breakdown occurred in the central communal courtyards. Because these central squares fell into a jurisdictional gray area, neither entirely private territory nor officially public city land, no single entity took responsibility for maintaining them, leading to significant degradation. Additionally, the residents actively rejected the architect's idealized vision of a quaint rural village backdrop. As incomes grew, inhabitants aggressively remodeled their starter homes, using modern concrete to build outward and alter the human scale. Over time, the development fractured. Some clusters walled themselves off into gated communities, while adjacent areas severely degraded, creating extreme disparities. An architect's pristine vision of perfectly balanced social harmony rarely survives direct contact with the messy, highly idiosyncratic nature of actual human culture. Looking at the chaotic aesthetics and structural disparities in Bellapore today, it is tempting to label the entire experiment a failure. But compare these messy, individualized modifications with the rigid, devastating uniformity of the monolithic towers that typically dominate the urban skyline. Bellapore succeeded in its most critical objective. It gave people the exact structural freedom to express their own culture and alter their environment, whether they used a paintbrush, a brick, or raw concrete. The staggered road networks and distinct housing clusters successfully forged collections of isolated individuals into highly interactive, localized community groups. Mass housing cannot be solved by delivering a finished, static product. It is an evolving process that requires continuous participation from the people living inside it. The urban planner's responsibility is to calculate the precise structural boundaries where a culture can safely build its own nest.